Today's shiur begins in the middle of Daf Dalid. You'll notice Mishnah in the middle, 21 lines from the top. We begin. Hareini k'Shimshon k'ben Manoach k'Baal Delila. Someone accepts upon himself, or vows, to be like Shimshon, the son of Manoach, the husband of Delila. The Rabbeinu Tam has a girsa as follows: U kemi she'okar dalsois aza, U kemi shenokru plishtim es einov. Or someone says he wants to be like the one who uprooted the gates of the city of Aza, which of course is a reference to Shimshon, or to be like the one whom the Philistines gouged out his eyes. Harei zeh Nazir Shimshon. The result of these different expressions is that the person will be a Nazir like Shimshon. What characterizes a Nazir Shimshon? This will be discussed in the next Mishnah, when the Mishnah asks what is the difference between a Nazir Olam and a Nazir Shimshon. We can say at this point, though, that Shimshon was a lifetime Nazir. So if one uses any of these expressions, so he will become just that, a Nazir like Shimshon. The Gemara asks regarding the language of the Mishnah, Loma li lemisne kol halin. In order for one to become a Nazir like Shimshon, why were all these descriptions necessary? Tzrichi. So in order to conclude that he would be a Nazir like Shimshon of biblical fame, you need all of these expressions. And what do we mean by all of these? So let's go on in the Gamora. Di'i Omar Hareini k'Shimshon. If a person would have said, I am going to be like Shimshon, Havi Amino Shimshon Achrina, I would have thought he's referring to some other Shimshon. If you open a phone book, you'll find many people with the name Shimshon. It's not clear what he would have been saying had he just said that. Komash Malon keben Manoach. Therefore, the Mishnah adds that if he's interested in accepting upon himself Nazirus like that of Shimshon of biblical fame, he would have to have said K'Shimshon ben Manoach. V'itana keben Manoach. And had he said that, now some girsos, it appears maybe the Tosfos has a following girsa as well, that the Gemara at this point is saying that had he said, I would be like Shimshon ben Manoach, have amino, I would have thought, iko de miskeri hachi, there are other people out there, Shimshon ben Manoach. Therefore, komash malon kibal delila. Therefore, once again, following the Tosfos interpretation, in order for him to accept, and for us to be clear that he's accepting the type of Nazirus that Shimshon of biblical fame practiced, he would have to say, Hareini k'Shimshon ben Manoach k'Baal Delila. I am like Samson, the son of Manoach, the husband of Delilah. Alternatively, he could have said, Ukemi shenokru plishtim es einov. Or he could have said, like we saw in the Mishnah, Kemi she'okar dalsois aza. Those expressions on their own would have been clear. There are no other people of that having that fame, i.e., that they uprooted the gates of Aza, or that their eyes were gouged out by the Philistines. So at this point, it would seem that there are three expressions that would lead one to becoming a Nazir Shimshon. The first being, had he said, I would like to be like Shimshon ben Manoach Baal Delila, or I'd like to be like the one that was Oiker Dalsis Aza, or I would like to be like the one whose eyes were gouged out by the Philistines. The Mishnah. Ma bein Nazir Olam le Nazir Shimshon. Having said already that Shimshon was a lifetime Nazir, what is the difference between someone who accepts upon himself the status of a Nazir Olam versus that of a Nazir Shimshon? So the Mishnah answers, Nazir Olam hich b'tzairo meko b'taro mevi sholosh behemas. A person who accepts upon himself Nazir Olam status, if his hair becomes lengthy or literally heavy, he can cut the hair to reduce the load of hair on his head. And in doing so, he'll have to bring 3 sacrifices, 3 behemoths, 3 animal offerings, which is characteristic of a Nazir when he takes his haircut. Ve'im nitma mevi korban tuma, and if he, the Nazir Olam, becomes defiled to the dead, so then he has to bring the relevant sacrifices. Nazir Shimshon. Now, in contrast, the Nazir Shimshon hichbet sayro eno meko. His hair might get heavy, like very long, he can't reduce it. Ve'im nitma eno mevi korban tuma, and if he becomes defiled, he does not bring a korban of tuma. The korban tuma being of 2 birds and a guilt offering, 2 birds, an oif, that's a chatos, oif, it's an oila, and an animal, that's an osham. The Gemara asks, regarding the Mishnah asked, what is the difference between a Nazir Olam and a Nazir Shimshon, but we haven't heard that there exists such a thing, such a practice as a Nazir Olam. Before you can ask what is the difference between these 2 items, you have to establish that they both exist. So, Nazir Olam man dekar shmei, who made any mention of the existence of such a practice known as Nazir Olam? The Gemara answers, the Mishnah is actually taught in a terse fashion, and in order to appreciate its real meaning, its real understanding, the following would have to be spelled out. Ha'omer hareini Nazir Olam harezen Nazir Olam. One who accepts upon himself permanent Nazirite status, he becomes thus. Ma bein Nazir Olam le Nazir Shimshon. Now that we've established that there is such a practice known as Nazir Olam, we can ask the question that we saw in the Mishnah: what is the difference between a Nazir Olam and a Nazir Shimshon? And the Nazir Shimshon we've already established, and we know that from the scriptures that he was a permanent Nazir. So what's the difference between these 2? Nazir Olam hichbet saro meko betar mevi sholosh behemos v'nitmo mevi korban tuma. Just like we saw in the Mishnah. Nazir Shimshon hichbet saro eno meko betar v'eno. We continue at the top of Omid Beis v'eno mevi korban tuma. The Gemara infers korban hu delo maisi avol nazirus chayli ole. The Mishnah is telling us that if he becomes defiled, so he doesn't bring the korban of a Nazir Tameh, but the acceptance of Nazir Shimshon, as the Nazirus of Shimshon, does set in. He does become a Nazir. Moni Masnisen. Well, with that having been said, according to whom is our Mishnah? In other words, our Mishnah is authored by which Tana? Lowe Rebbe Yehuda, below Rebbe Shimon. It doesn't appear to be consistent with either of these Tanaic opinions, and we're beginning a long question, as you can see, according to our markings. So according to our Mishnah, and the topic heading on the side, in the margin of the Gemara reads, Lefi Mishnah Seinu, according to our Mishnah, Ziru Shimshon Nitan Lekabel, it is possible to accept that type of Naziru. So mashma the heter tumo lemesim hurak b'di'eved, and it appears from our Mishnah that defilement to the dead is acceptable, but only post facto, not as a first choice with regard to someone who is a Nazir Shimshon. So with that having been said, Moni Masnisen, who would have said all of that? Namely, that you can become a Nazir Shimshon, and that there exists a primary prohibition of the Nazir Shimshon defiling himself to the dead. So as we saw in the Gemara, that doesn't seem to conform to either the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda nor Rabbi Shimon. The Sanyo, Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, Nazir Shimshon muter letame lemesim. Here you see, not like what was implied by the Mishnah, that a Nazir Shimshon is allowed to defile himself to the dead. Shekein motzinu b'Shimshon shenitma. we found in the biblical passage featuring Shimshon that he defiled himself to the dead. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ha'omir Nazir Shimshon lo omar klum. And Rabbi Shimon taking the other extreme, that one who says, I am a Nazir like Shimshon, said nothing. Shelo matzinu b'Shimshon sheyotzas nazirus mipiv. We don't find that Shimshon himself, of biblical fame, accepted upon himself Nazirus. According to Rabbi Shimon, then it appears that in order for Nazirus to take hold, it would have to be some practice that one accepts upon himself. We don't find that Shimshon nor his father accepted upon them. Shimshon, in the case of his father, a father has a right to impose Nazirus on his son, but we don't find that having taken place in the case of Shimshon. So, Moni, our Mishnah is in accordance with whom? Rabbi Yehuda ha'amar afilu l'chatchila. If our Mishnah were to be Rabbi Yehuda, he said he can, as a first choice, the Nazir Shimshon as a first choice can defile himself to the dead. Umasnisin kotoni im nitma. And our Mishnah states it in the post facto fashion, that if he became Tomei, but not that a Nazir Shimshon is allowed to defile himself. And Rabbi Shimon, if our Mishnah were in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, a person who declares himself a Nazir Shimshon has said nothing. But our Mishnah doesn't say like that. Li'olam, Rabbi Yehuda, in truth, our Mishnah is like Rabbi Yehuda. The Aidi de Kotoni Gabi Nazir Olam im Nitma, since the Mishnah taught with regard to the Nazir Olam defilement as a post facto situation, if he became Tameh, not as a first choice. So, to maintain, we'll say, the similarity of style, of literary style, Tononami Gabi Nazir Shimshon im Nitma. So, the Mishnah taught in the context of Nazir Shimshon similarly, if he became Tameh. But in fact, there is that difference, that a Nazir Olam is not allowed to, as a first choice, expose himself to defilement of the dead, whereas a Nazir Shimshon, even according to our Mishnah, like Rabbi Yehuda, is allowed to initially expose himself as a first choice, if he should so desire, to defilement to the dead. At this point, we raise a question. It lasts a few lines, and on the side of our Gamora, under the Tat Nausea being a sub-topic heading, we've written, Nisayon lahamid machlokes hatanoim bechalus Nazir Shimshon kemachlokes tanoim achirim. There's an attempt in our Gemara to parallel our machlokes tanoim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, regarding Nazir Shimshon. Is it a practice that takes hold? And parallel to another machlokes tanoim, be'inyan hamatfis nidro bevachor, someone who expressly dedicates, let's say, some vow to be parallel to a bechor. For example, Harei olai ki bechor. A person says that he accepts upon himself that a particular item is like to be like a bechor. Bechor is a firstborn male animal, when in reality a person experiences a firstborn kosher variety male animal born in his herd or in his flock. It is holy. It is in the time of the Beis Hamikdash to be given to a Kohen who would bring it as a sacrifice to the Beis Hamikdash. The bechor, technically speaking, is holy upon birth, even without your intervention, even without your declaration of sanctity. So we continue with the note on the side. We want to, as we said, parallel our machlokes tanoim regarding Nazir Shimshon. Is it a reality? To a machlokes tanoim regarding someone who compares an item to a bechor. Klomar, hatzorech lahatpis nidro dafka bedavar hanodor. For a neder, for a vow to take hold, is it absolutely necessary to parallel the item that you are, let us say, trying to forbid as a vow to an item that itself was previously made prohibited through a type of sanctification or a vow. When you sanctify something or dedicate something to the holy temple, so you are responsible for its prohibition for personal use. This might sound a bit abstract, but as we go on in the Gamora using examples, this will become clearer. So now, as we said, we have a question. It lasts a few lines. Lemo beplukto dahani tanoi komiflugi. Can we say that the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda acknowledging Nazir Shimshon as a reality, Rabbi Shimon saying it doesn't exist, parallels the following machlokes tanoim. Disnan, hare olai kibachor. A person would say, for example, I accept upon myself this loaf of bread to be like a bechor. Maybe we should say, just by way of general introduction, that if someone says hare olai kikar zu ke korban shlomim, that would become a vow. Or hare olai ke korban ola. If a person parallels an item, he says, I accept upon myself that this chair is to be upon me like a korban ola. A korban ola, an ola sacrifice is an animal that you made prohibited. You sanctified it, and hence it's not available for personal use. That takes hold. What happens if you say, Hare olai kikar zu, I accept upon myself that this bread is to be to me like a bechor? Rabbi Yankiv Ozer. Rabbi Yankiv says such a vow takes hold. Rabbi Yossi matir. Rabbi Yossi says such a vow is meaningless. My lav. So now, with that having been said, can we say the following: that Rabbi Yehuda, who acknowledged the existence of a Nazir Shimshon, savar lo Rabbi Yankiv. He holds like Rabbi Yankiv that when one declares an item to be upon himself like a bechor, it takes hold. Diomar lo bo'inon davor hanidar. That in establishing a vow, you don't need to parallel the item. We spoke about a loaf of bread or a chair or whatever. You don't need to parallel it to something that was made prohibited by you. The item that you are currently prohibiting doesn't have to be molded or patterned after something else that is also made prohibited by you. For Rabbi Shimon Savar law Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon, who said that Nazir Shimshon doesn't exist, he would hold like Rabbi Yossi Domar, that holds that in order for a vow to take hold, bo'inon dover hanidar, you have to parallel the item you want to prohibit right now to something else that becomes prohibited through your intervention. So, as we said at the beginning of this question, can we make this parallel between the two Tanaic controversies? The Gemara says, Lowe, that is not the case. The Kulei Alma, Rabbi Yankiv and Rabbi Yossi, both of them, Bo'inon Dover Hanidar, they say that in order for something to be prohibited through the mechanism of a vow, you would have to parallel it to something that itself is made prohibited by your intervention, by your declaration. And therefore, Shimshon, who we never saw, became also through personal acceptance, through Shimshon having accepted upon himself a vow of Nazirus. So Rabbi Yankiv and Rabbi Yossi would both, between themselves, would say that a person who declares himself a Nazir Shimshon, he has said nothing. Well, if that's the case, if they agree that you need to parallel your neder, your vow, to something that itself is nidar, that something else that you declare or you make Ozer, then why does Rabbi Yankiv say, in the case of Bechor, which we said, you don't really make Ozer, it's born Ozer? Why does such a vow, when you parallel something to a Bechor, why does that take hold? V'shayni gabi Bechor. The case of Bechor is different. The Ksiv Bei Lashem. There's a reference in the Pasuk to God's name, and since Lashem appears in the Pasuk, it says, the Pasuk says, Ish ki yidor neder Lashem. And that Lashem word, a name that appears in the context of vow making, is L'Rabois es HaBechor. That comes to include paralleling items to a Bechor. Even though a Bechor is not a real Davar HaNidar, but it's an exception. It's an example of something that can be used to formulate a vow. As we said, I want a person prohibits upon himself the use of a chair like a Bechor. Reb Yossi, Omar Loch, Reb Yossi, who said that paralleling something to a Bechor is useless, it's futile. Hahu Lashem, the name Lashem in the pasuk that we cited, Miboyalei, he needs it for something else. L'Rabois Chatos V'Osham, to include as a useful vow model, paralleling something to a sin offering or a guilt offering. Now, let's just point out that a korban chatas or korban osham are not voluntary offerings. They're not a type of sacrifice that you electively sanctify. Electively meaning that through your own, let's say, good nature, decide to sanctify. If one sinned, so then he's required, assuming it's that type of sin that warrants these kind of sacrifices, so then he's obligated to bring these sacrifices. So the Chatas and Osham, as the Gamora will go on to point out, have a certain unique status in the realm of vow making, but suffice it to say that Reb Yossi does find value in the Lashem word in the Pasuk to expand the, let's say, models to which one can parallel his vow to a Chatas or Osham. Uma royis l'rabbis Chatas v'Osham l'hoitzias b'chor. Turning to Reb Yossi, we ask, why is it that he's willing to accept the Chatas and Osham as serving as a model for a vow, as a mold according to which one can parallel the item to those things, and exclude a Bechor? Answer, Mar bani Chatas v'Osham. The Chatas and Osham can serve as the model for a vow, Shikein matpison beneder. Because those animals, or those kind of sacrifices, you must expressly dedicate. That's matpisan beneder. You must expressly dedicate them to be thus. In other words, if you let us say, violated that type of sin that warrants the bringing of a Chatas or Osham, you would have to initiate the sanctification of animals in your flock to serve as a Chatas or Osham. Umotzi ani es ha-bechor shein matpisa beneder, and I exclude though the Bechor. The Bechor has no connection to vowing. It has no connection to any, let's say, human initiative in terms of imposing prohibition. It's born that way. It's born prohibited. For Rabbi Yankiv Omar Loch, Rabbi Yankiv tells us Bechor nami matpisa beneder hu. The Bechor does have an element of dedication associated with it. The Sanyo, as the following source reveals, Shel Beis Rabbeinu Omru, in the house of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, it was said, Minayin l'noilad lo b'chor b'soch edro she mitzvah lov lahakdisho. From where do we know that someone that has a firstborn male animal born in his flock, that there is a mitzvah upon him to sanctify it? Shenema, the pasuk says, Hazachor takdish. The male you shall sanctify. For Rabbi Yossi Omalach, Rabbi Yossi, who denied any value to a Bechor, He will tell you, Nehi de mitzvah adisho, granted that you have fulfilled a precept if you sanctify it. However, lo makdish le mi lo kadosh, and if you didn't initiate sanctity upon the Bechor, would it not be holy? It certainly would be holy anyway. The Gemara asks, Gabi Nazir nami hok siv Lashem. You find the term Lashem found in the context of Nazir. So why then would Rabbi Yankov of Bechor, Rabbi Yankov, who we saw above, was willing to accept as a legitimate vow the paralleling to a Bechor, why not say that Lashem by Nazir includes Nazir Shimshon? The Gamora answers, Hahu miboyale Sanyo. The Lashem term that you find in the case of Nazirus has already a separate function. I need it for the following. We're going to read a Tanaic source. There's a story in this source, and we're going to see that the Lashem teaches us concerning one who accepts upon himself Nazirus in a truly Lashem Shomayim fashion, a truly holy, benevolent, heavenly motivated fashion. Omar Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was from the very beginning of the Tanaic period, and he lived during the time, of course, of the Beis Hamikdash. He says, "Miyomai lo ochalti oshem nazir tomei chutz mi odom echad." I never partook of the guilt offering brought by a Nazir who became defiled to the dead, with the exception of one case, one person. Shaboy lai min adorom, a fellow came for me from the south. Yefei nayim v'toiv roi, with a nice looking fellow, nice eyes, pleasant appearance. And he had locks of hair that were set up in rows on his head. I asked him, and I know that you're a Nazir. A Nazir at the end of his Nazir's period has to cut his hair. And I asked him, what is it that motivated you to accept Nazirus, that you now have to cut such beautiful hair? Omar li. So the man said, Roya hoyisi lavi be'iri. I was a shepherd for my father in my town. Volachti v'shoiv mayim min ha'mayon, and I went to draw water from the spring. V'nistakalti b'babua sheli, and I gazed upon the reflection, my reflection in the water. Upochaz yitzri olai, and my evil inclination got the better of me. I saw in the reflection such a good-looking man. Ubikesh l'tardani min ha'olam, and with that emotion, it sought to cast me out of this world. Amarti Lowe, I said to it, to the reflection, I said to myself, Reka, you empty one, how is it that you become so overcome with feelings of haughtiness in a world that doesn't belong to you, that whose end is decomposition and worms? This is an expression of a vow. And I'm going to shave you. I'm going to remove all the hair, all the beauty, for the sake of heaven. Well, this is what the man told me, said Shimon HaTzadik. Omadeti v'neshachtiv al roisha, I stood up and I kissed him on his head. Amarti lo kamoischa yarbi nazir b'Yisrael. Like you, there shall increase in numbers Nazirim amongst the Jewish people. Alecha hakosav oimer, regarding someone like you, the pasuk says, Ish ki afli lindor neder nazir lahazir Lashem, a person who vows to accept upon himself Nazirus for purely heavenly purposes. So Shimon HaTzadik tells us a story about a man whose Nazirus was so pure in its intention, so heavenly motivated, that even though they experienced defilement, he had no hesitation to partake of his sacrifices, as opposed to a common situation of Nazir defilement where one could be suspect that a person would come to regret having accepted the Nazirus, because upon defilement, as we've mentioned in previous shiurim, he elongates the Nazirus period, and he might come to regret the whole thing, and bringing sacrifices in with feelings of regret borders on the sin of chulin lazor, bringing animals that aren't even fit to be brought as sacrifices, and the likes of Shimon HaTzadik wouldn't want to be involved with eating of animals of sacrificial meat like that. But someone like this, who is so heavenly motivated, all of those concerns about possible regret, even though they become defiled, fall away. And this is all learned from the Lashem that's in the pasuk of Nazir. So Lashem is not going to include Nazir Shimshon as a means of Nazirus as far as even Rabbi Yankiv is concerned. So though Rabbi Yankiv is willing to accept modeling something after a Bechor because of the Lashem in that pasuk that we cited earlier, but he's not going to include Nazir Shimshon as a Nazirus option. We continue in the Gemara. The Shimshon lav Nazir have. Is it really so, as we've been assuming along the way, that Shimshon did not become a Nazir through standard vow procedures? V'oksiv, the pasuk in the case of Shimshon in the book of Judges, Shoftim Perek Yud Gimel, it says, Ki Nazir Elikim Yehanar min habeten. Now, the thinking at this point is, as far as the Shimshon story is concerned, that an angel appeared and told the father of Shimshon to impose on your son Nazirus. And if that would have been done, if that would have been the actual story, so then Shimshon is an example of something accepted through standard vow methods. Why then have we been treating Shimshon as an example of something that's not a dover hanidar? The Gemara says, in fact, Shimshon was not a Nazir through standard vow acceptance procedures. Hasamalahu de Ka'amar. There, in the case of Shimshon, it was the angel of God that declared that Shimshon will be a Nazir without any statement of Nazirus acceptance either from Shimshon or his father. So Shimshon was a Nazir, but that was some type of, we'll say, divine declaration as opposed to a personal human acceptance as such. Does Nazir Shimshon exist? So we saw, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Nazir Shimshon exists as Nazirus, and that is only a result of a pasuk that comes to include Nazir Shimshon, we'll say, as a reality. The explanation we just gave regarding Shitas Rabbi Yehuda can be found in the Rush, though there are other explanations as far as how Rabbi Yehuda comes to the conclusion that Nazir Shimshon is a reality. Let's continue in the Gemara. Uminolon di'itmi lemesim. From where do we know that Shimshon defiled himself to the dead? As we mentioned earlier, the difference between a Nazir Olam and a Nazir Shimshon was that the Nazir Olam is not allowed to, as a first choice, defile himself to the dead, whereas Nazir Shimshon can, and that would be based on the fact that Shimshon, the original Nazir Shimshon, had defiled himself to the dead. Where do we see evidence of that? On the side of the Gemara, we have a Nausea mivneh heading. A triangle appears, and you'll see it appears in alternating directions. This is a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track of the give and take of the Gemara. So with the point facing up, nisyonis lanis l'sheila, these are attempts to answer the question, from where do we know that Shimshon of biblical fame defiled himself to the dead? The inverted triangle represents Dechios rejections of whatever was suggested. So we continue with the Gemara. After having asked from where do we know that he was mitamel amesim, I leimo midichtiv belechia chamori kese elefish. In the pasuk, Shimshon announces that with the jaw of a donkey, I killed 1,000 men. The Gemara says that doesn't show that he defiled himself to the dead, though. Dilmo giruye gori bahu v'lo noga bahu. Maybe he hurled the jaw of the donkey toward them and through that killed them. But that doesn't mean he had actual contact with them, thereby killing them and thereby becoming defiled. Elo mehacha, from the following. Vayach mehem shloishim ish vayikach es chalitzosam. He killed 30 men and took their garments. So it would seem from here that first he killed them, they were dead, and then he removed their garments. He would have had to come into contact or overshadow them, thereby becoming defiled to the dead. The Gemara says not so. Dilmo ashlechinun bereisha v'hodar katlinon. Maybe, as was well known, he was a very strong warrior-like figure, that he actually stripped them first and then killed them. So that his contact with them after they were dead is not necessarily demonstrated in this source. The Gemara says that's not so, though. Vayach vayikach siv. The order of the pasuk indicates first he smote them and then he took their garments, so that he did become defiled to the dead, as this pasuk indicates. The Gemara says no, it's not convincing. V'dilma goysesim shavinon. Maybe he mortally wounded them, creating a goses state. Goses is people in the throes of death, not actually dead yet, but in the throes of death. They were in that state when he stripped them, thereby avoiding defilement, and only later did they actually die. So how do you know that Shimshon defiled himself to the dead? Ella Gamora Gemiri Law. It's an oral tradition. We don't have solid scriptural evidence to that effect, but we do know through this oral tradition. Now the Gemara reverts back to the topic of the Nazir Olam. The Nazir Olam Heicha Ksiv. Regarding a Nazir Olam, where do you see that he is allowed to reduce the hair burden upon his head and bring the 3 animal offerings that accompany that cutting of hair? The Sanyo. So we have a Tanaic source, and on the side we have the Nausea mivneh heading, the topic heading and structural note. Number 1, Nazir Olam Heicha Ksiv. Where is there scriptural reference to the Nazir Olam, and as we added the allowance of cutting the hair and then the bringing of the 3 sacrifices? And the diamonds that you see throughout this source, which continues on to Daf Hey Amud Aleph, are Shitos binyan zmane giluach shel Nazir Olam, the time frame within which a Nazir Olam is allowed to reduce his hair burden. So the source, Rebbe Omer, Avshalom Nazir Olam Haya. Avshalom, the son of King David, was a Nazir Olam. Shenamar, the pasuk says, Vayimi Ketzar Boyim Shana, Vayomer Avshalom El Melech, and it was after 40 years. Later, the Gamora will ask, this 40 years started at what point in time? Here it says at the end of the 40 years. Beginning with what? Okay, that we'll discuss later. So it was at the end of 40 years, Vayomer Avshalom el HaMelech, and Avshalom said to his father, the king, Elcha no v'ashalem es nidri asher nadarti Lashem b'Chevron. I want to go and fulfill my vow that I vowed in Chevron. Tosfos explains that a stam neder, an unqualified vow, implies nazirus. So from this we see that he, Avshalom, had accepted upon himself nazirus. And the trip to Chevron was in order for him to take his haircut and bring the sacrifices, the 3 sacrifices. This, of course, is at a time in history before the Beis Hamikdash had been set up. Umigaleach echod l'shnei moser chodesh. Rebbe tells us, this is Rebbe's opinion, and that is that the Nazir Olam reduces his hair burden once every 12 months, once a year. Shneimar v'oyo miketz yomim liyomim. Once again, the pasuk in that very context involving Avshalom. The Gemara continues at the top of Hey Amud Aleph, v'yolif yomim yomim mibote orei choma. The term yomim that you find by Avshalom is learned from the topic of houses in walled cities. Ma hasam yud beis chodesh, af kan yud beis chodesh. Just like the topic of houses in walled cities, the halacha concerning those houses states that if a person sells a house in a walled city, he can buy it back from the purchaser within 1 year of his sale. However, if the house that was sold remains in the hands of the purchaser more than a year, the original buyer cannot force its resale back to him. So the law concerning Boter Choma is 1 year. Within 1 year you can force the resale back to the original owner, and the pasuk there says Yomim Tieh Gulaso. That pasuk is quoted in the Rashi as well. So just like over there by Boter Choma, it's a 12-month halacha, so too here the Nazir Olam haircut time frame is every 12 months, because here too you see the word yomim. He has a different time frame, once every 30 days. The Nazir Olam is entitled to reduce his hair, to cut his hair every week, from Friday to Friday. That is the practice, that's the custom of princes, to cut their hair once a week. And now we go over the opinions that we saw. My time of the Rebbe, what's the basis of Rebbe's opinion of once every 12 months? Well, we said Yolif Meibote Orechoma. He learns from the law concerning houses sold within walled cities. Vaha Rebbe Hudamar Ein Yomim Pusin Mishnayim. But 1 second, Rebbe, within the same context of Bote Orechoma, said that the word yomim is the plural form of the word yom. Yom is a day. Yomim would be 2 days. So if you see the word yomim in a plural form, it's no less than 2. And what Rebbe is referring to is that a person who sells a house to a purchaser in a walled city, it's a house in a walled city sold to a purchaser, it shall remain in the hands of the purchaser for 2 days. That means within 2 days you cannot force the resale of that house. So if this be the case, so then let us say that the Nazir Olam can take a haircut every 2 days. Shall we say that? The Gamora says no. Hai Gezerah Shava Mishum Kovid Gomir. The Gezerah Shava of Yomim Yomim, the word comparison involving Yomim Yomim was a word comparison within the context of overgrown hair, of heaviness or extended length of hair. Within 2 days, you don't experience increased growth of hair. So that's patently rejected as a possible alternative meaning of Yomim as far as the Gezerah Shava and Rebbe are concerned. So therefore you're left with the other halacha of Bater Choma, namely that the buyback, if the original seller is interested, must take place within a year. On the side, we have an explanation of this marking scheme that you see. Just by skimming ahead in the Gemara, you see houses and double underlines repeated. So under the Mivneh heading, we've written Hatzos, Chilufios. These are alternative suggestions. B'shitasa Sherebi, within Rebbe's opinion, Shalomad Gzereshava Yomim Yomim Be'inyan Zmanim Shemutu L'Nazir Olam L'Hakil Sairo. We saw the word comparison involving Yomim Yomim. According to Rebbe, it tells us that a Nazir Olam can reduce his hair burden once a year. Could Rebbe not actually have learned a word comparison with leading to a different conclusion? So we saw one suggestion already, that every 2 days. Well, we rejected that because the whole purpose of this word comparison was within the context of overgrown hair. Koved means heaviness of hair, and that's not something that one experiences within 2 days. Well, the Gemara continues, V'ema shnei shonim dichtiv, maybe Yomim means at the end of 2 years, that only once every 2 years can the Nazir Olam take his haircut dichtiv. The pasuk says, Vayhi miketz shnosayim Yomim. So you see in Sefer Bereshis the term Yomim appearing in the context of after 2 years. The Gemara responds, that's not going to change Rebbe's point of view. Why? Donin Yomim Shenim Shonim Mi Yomim Shenim Shonim. I have in the case of Avshalom, who was a Nazir Olam, the word Yomim without it being coupled with the word Shonim, and therefore in the case of Botei Orei Choyma, I find a similar phenomenon. V'al yochiach zeh sheyesh imo shonim, and do not let prove this pasuk from Bereshis Perek Mem Aleph, where it's true you see the word Yomim, but it's coupled with the word Shonim, Shnosayim Yomim. So it's less, let's say, it's less parallel, less similar to the case of, or to the appearance of the word Yomim by the Nazir Olam. Question, V'ema shloshim yom, maybe Yomim is a reference to a 30-day period. Once every 30 days he could take his haircut. D'chtiv ad chodesh Yomim. Here you have the word Yomim in the context of 1 month. The Gemara says, no, this is not going to influence Rebbe either. Donin Yomim Sheni Moem Chadoshim, Mi Yomim Sheni Moem Chadoshim. I would prefer to maintain the similarity of Yomim as it appears by Nazir Olam to another case where Yomim appears without Chadoshim attached to it, like you find by the Bater Choyma. And do not allow this to prove what Yomim means, because here in this pasuk just cited by Midvar Perek Yud Aleph, you have the word Yomim coupled with Chodesh. So again, it's not the same as the word Yomim as it appears by Avshalom and the Nazir Olam, where it was Yomim without Chodesh. Question: V'yemo mehacha. Maybe we should learn Yomim from the following. Here's a pasuk that deals with the daughter of Yiftach. Yiftach was one of the judges during the period of the Shoftim, and in the context of the daughter of Yiftach, without getting into the entire storyline that you find in the book of Judges, we can just continue with the verses themselves. It says there, Miyomim Yomima. And as Rashi explains, the friends, the girls of Israel who were friendly with this woman, the daughter of Yiftach, they visited her Miyomim Yomima, they visit her 4 times a year. If you take a year and you divide it into 4 parts, you get 3 months each section. So they visited her 4 times a year. That's Miyomim Yomima. Yomim, it seems like you have the word Yom doubled twice. It's 2 times 2 is 4. So they visit her 4 times a year. That means every 3 months. And therefore, if you were to use this as the source for what Yomim means, and transfer it to the case of the Nazir Olam would take his haircut once every 3 months. Not like what Rebbe said, once a year. So why is it that Rebbe chooses to learn Nazir Olam for Bote Orichoma, leading to the conclusion of once a year and not from here? So the Gemara has a couple of answers, 2 answers. Number 1, Donin Yomim mi Yomim, v'ein Donin Yomim mi Yom, v'ein Donin Yomim mi Yomima. We want to keep the similarity as tight as possible, so I'll compare the word Yomim to the other context where you find that same word, Yomim, and I'm not going to learn Yomim that you find by the Nazir Olam from a pasuk where the word Yomimo applies. It's a different word. The Gemara asks, Umay nafka mina, what difference does it make if the word is exactly the same or not exactly the same? There's a very brief Tanaic source in which you see a comparison between 2 points within the context of the laws of a house stricken with tsaras. It says Vishav HaKohen Ubo HaKohen. So in one pasuk the word Vishav appears, and the other pasuk the word Bo. They're different words, and we learn Zuhi Shiva, Zuhi Bia. The laws that apply in one case apply in the other case. Once again, we're avoiding getting into the details behind the laws of tsaras as referred to there in the pasuk. So we see that the exact similarity of words is not the all-important factor in establishing Gzeira Shava, word comparison. So then why is it that just because by the Bas Yiftach in Shoftim, in the book of Judges, you see the word Yomima, can we not say, let us learn from there to the Nazir Olam that he takes a haircut once every 3 months? The Gemara answers, Hani mili hecha deleko de domile. This is true that we don't insist on exact similarity when you don't have any other competition for the word comparison. But in a case where you have a word, in our case, Yomim, and we don't know exactly what it means by the Nazir Olam, and I have a choice to compare it to topic number 1, where I see the exact same word, like Bote Orechoma, which would lead me to say once a year, or to compare it to another topic, like by the Bas Yiftach, where the word isn't exactly the same, I would rather compare Yomim to the topic of Boter Choma, where the exact same word appears. So just to repeat this point, yes, it's true we have flexibility in terms of exactness, but that's when I don't have an alternative source to which to compare it. But where I have an alternative source to which to compare it, and the words in those 2 cases are exactly the same, I would opt for that and abandon the comparison that would not be exactly the same. E boyas emo. Another answer, another approach to why I'm not going to learn from the Bas Yiftach, which we saw a reference to 4 times a year she was visited by her friends, and the word Yomima, the reason I'm not going to learn from there is Minoya Dino Dechol Talse Tlose Yarchin Chad Zimna, who says that it was an equal division of 3 months, 4 times a year. Who says that each visit was after 3 months? It's true that in the course of the year she was visited by her friends 4 times, but who says it was 4 equal divisions of the year? Dilma Arba zimni b'shasa. Arba, maybe the 4 times a year is as follows. Arba yarchin chad zimna, train yarchin b'chad zimna. After 4 months, she was visited once, and then after 2 months, a second time. After 4 more months, a third time, and after 2 months, the 4th time. In other words, unequal time gaps that established the visitation. So, the reason that we're not going to learn from the pasuk of Miyomim Yomima with the Bas Yiftach is simply because we don't have a guarantee, we don't know for sure what the gaps in time were that the words Yomim Yomima indicate. So if I have something that's unsure, and I have the other source, the case of the Botei Orachoma, where it is sure, I'm going to learn from, I'll take the sure bet, so to speak, and learn Nazir Olam once a year from Botei Orachoma, and I'm not going to learn the Nazir Olam haircut time frame from a source where the time gaps aren't really clear. And now we go on with a quote from the second opinion above. The arrow to the side helps you to find where it was. Rabbi Nehoroi Omer, Megalech Achas L'Shloishim Yom. According to Rabbi Nehoroi, the Nazir Olam is entitled to lessen his hair burden, take a haircut once every 30 days. My Taimo Gabi Kohanim, Mishum Diika Koived. Why is it that we find Kohanim taking a haircut once every 30 days? In other words, before a Kohen can serve in the Beis HaMikdash, he must not have a hair growth on his head of more than 30 days. So, just to keep things simple, we say that a Kohen Hedyot must take a haircut every 30 days. And that's because of COVID, because 30 days of hair growth represents a burden of hair. Hachinami Ika Koved. So too here by the Nazir Olam, when he reaches a point that the hair is heavy upon his head, so he is entitled to take the haircut. But not within that time, not less than 30 days, because like by the Kohen, they haven't reached a situation of it being called Koved. Rabbi Yossi Omer Megalech Mer of Shabbos Le'Rav Shabbos. Rabbi Yossi was the third opinion that we saw in the source above. The haircut of the Nazir Olam can be once a week, from Friday to Friday. My Ika Binei Lishar Achoi. What's going to be the difference between Avshalom, who was also a Ben Melech, he was a prince, and any other prince, any other Ben Melech? There's a Tosfos in the middle that says, Ma'iko binei l'shar achoi. V'im tomar, you might ask, v'neimo d'iko binaya. There's an obvious different korbanos. The need to bring sacrifices to who maybe. He, as a Nazir, taking a haircut, has to bring sacrifices v'lohein. Not them. They, just out of, cosmetic purposes, are taking their haircut every Friday. The Yesh Lomar, the answer to this question is Dachi Kamar. When the Gamora is asking its question, it's asking it as follows: Ma ika b'nei b'tiglechas. The Kamar krov ha'imikates yomim asher yigalech mashma t'piglechas hoya me'acher. The pasuk seems to indicate that you see a difference between Avshalom and his other brothers within the haircut itself, so that, of course, there are other differences, but within the haircut itself, where do you see a difference? So the Gemara answers. Number 1, Yom Tov Shechalios B'Emtze Shabbos. A case of Yom Tov, a holiday falling out in the middle of a week. B'Emtze Shabbos, word Shabbos means, in this case, a week. In such a case, Dachoy Megalchin, the princes, his brothers, would take the haircut on Erev Yom Tov, that is coming out in the middle of the week. Hu lo megalech, but he would not. His haircut is literally from Friday to Friday, not in the middle of the week, even if it happens to be the day before a Yom Tov. Inami, Ligluchi min safro demali Shabbat. Another point of difference would be taking a haircut Friday morning. Safra is the morning of Mali Shabbat. Mali Shabbat is Friday. Achay megalchin, the brothers would be able to take a haircut at that point. Ihu lo megalech ad panya. He, Avshalom, being a Nazir Olam, is allowed to take a haircut only ad panya, close to evening. The Gemara here asks a question based on that which we mentioned quite a bit earlier. We have a little arrow to the immediate right-hand side of the Gemara text indicating Dalad Beis, and you can see there the parallel arrow. The Pasuk had mentioned that Avshalom mentioned that he wanted to take care of his vow, and it was after 40 years. So that the Pasuk opened up with at the conclusion of 40 years, so the story involving Avshalom transpired. Hani Arboim Shana Mayavitai, what's the nature of these 40 years? It was at the end of 40. What happened 40 years earlier? Reb Noroi Oimer Mishum Reb Yoshua. Lekates, it was at the end of 40. Mem Shana Sheshalahen Melech. The Jewish people 40 years earlier had turned to the prophet Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, and asked of them, can we, the Jewish people, can we have a king? Tana, the source tells us, Oisa Shana Sheshala and Melech, the year that they had turned to the prophet Shmuel, requesting to have a king, he Shnas Eser L'Shmuel Ramasi. It was the 10th year of Shmuel's rule. He ruled as a prophet, as a leader of the Jewish people. Haramasi is a reference to Ramah, the place where Shmuel lived. So it was during the 10th year of Shmuel's rule that they turned to him asking for a king. So from that point, 40 years later, the story involving Avshalom had taken place. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.